This is the Constructionist Podcast, where we take ancient stories, the person of Jesus, current events and topics, and help you construct a new Christian worldview that's relevant and loving to those around you. I'm your host, Kevin Bates. I'm a semiotician and community builder, looking at the signs of the times to build a better future together. You are tuned into the Constructionist Podcast, and tonight we are continuing our 8-part series called The Body, Constructing a New You. And tonight's topic is on self-concept and beauty, and we are discussing how this affects our body. So we're going to come to those conclusions at the end of this podcast. So as the Constructionists, we desire for you to be able to navigate your life with a framework of a worldview that is relevant and loving to people. And part of this is getting our own house in order. So that's why we decided to do this topic at the beginning of the year, just an 8-week series to start out 2023 really well. If you can't figure out how to love yourself, it's going to be really hard loving others in some better capacity. So that's what we want to do through this series, is learn to love ourselves better, learn self-care, learn better concepts of who we are and what we are about. I want to encourage you to listen to the TED.com podcast, TED video on TED.com, The Benefits of Not Being a Jerk to Yourself, by Dan Harris. The Benefits of Not Being a Jerk to Yourself. You can find that on TED.com. Just search it, and it'll pop right up about one of the most popular videos of 2022. So in previous podcasts, we've made mention of this, that when we deconstruct old ideas and we don't have a vision forward, a pathway forward, when we don't have a chart forward, we usually end up exactly the same that we started with. Deconstructing ideas without a vision, we just become so different that we end up exactly the same as where we started. We don't want to do that. We want to break, like we talked about last week, break toxic behaviors, break toxic habits and old habits, and continue to construct and grab onto a new future. So this is our thinking space where we are presenting ideas and thoughts. Joined with me is Jacob Flug and Shreya Bodner. Good evening, both of you. So glad that you could join. Yes. And we are not claiming to be experts in psychology. We're not even claiming to be experts in theology. We are just claiming to be people that are having a discussion, musing and noodling around, trying to figure out a better way of life as God leads us. So this 8-part series, if you missed last week, was on hot habits and toxic behaviors. Go back, get caught up. If you missed the last 2 weeks, we started with goal setting, then habits and toxic behaviors, like I said. Tonight is self-concept and beauty. Then we're headed into fitness and nutrition, spiritual practice and meditation, healthy relationships, mental health, and then a highly neglected discipline is rest, finding enough rest to heal and rejuvenate so that we can work out of our rest instead of rest from our work. So a note to our supporters: you can support us financially by following the link. We're going to put that in the chat notes, in the show notes, in the chat, and you can link up to resonatelife.org, and you can connect into the Give tab, and under that you can financially support us. But more than money and more than financial support of any kind, we want you to listen, we want you to engage, and most importantly, we love the chat back and forth. We learn together. Again, this is our thinking and growing space. And so by doing this during these times and beyond all through the week, if you want to chat with us through the week, you can leave some notes and we'll pick those up during the week and respond. We promise we will do that. And it can be an iterative, interactive exercise that we can grow together. That's how we learn. That's how we experientially learn from one another, and we want to engage with you that way. All right, just a brief introduction to start. This has been quite the cool journey this week on self-concept and what self-concept is. And so I'm just going to give a really quick, brief introduction of just the self and who we are as God's people, but also just as human beings. I think that it's important to really be clear that we have labels that Christians sometimes use. We're Christian. or we are God's people. I do know that the Bible does say that we are God's people and that we are Christian people. We have those labels. But more importantly, I believe that Jesus came to make us whole human, that we are human beings. And we first have an obligation to treat each other as human beings and to treat ourselves as a human being. And that's where self-concept really comes into play, is to just identify our whole humanness. And that's really important to think about. And so you can muse around that topic for a while. So just a self-concept definition. There's actually lots of self-concept definitions, but I'm going to just pick one definition: the individual's belief about themselves, including the person's attributes and who and what the self is. Who and what the self is. That's by a person by the name of Baumeister out of 1999. Some articles: the individual's belief about themselves, including the person's attributes and who and what the self is. Another definition, older definition: the totality of an individual's thoughts and feelings having reference to themselves as a person and even as an object. So we talk a little bit about the objectification of others and self, and sometimes it's easy to think of ourselves as an object. I would like to change that older definition that was Rosenberg's definition from 1979. Calling ourselves an object is really unhealthy. So I would say to ourselves as a human being. So the totality of an individual's thoughts and feelings having reference to themselves as a human being. So self-construct or self-concept is, if you think about it, it's your self-construct: self-esteem, self-image, self-efficacy, self-awareness. All those selves build a self-construct, which is called a self-concept. Or self-concept is really important to be healthy. It's important to have a real, honest view of self. If we don't, then we start filtering our decisions, how we treat ourselves and others, and even God. We treat other persons in our life pretty much the same way that, well, possibly we are treating ourselves and the closest people around us. We just are treating them as a version of our own self-concept. So we need to be very careful. We need to think through those things and get ourselves in a place where we are surrounding ourselves with a healthy environment to grow and to learn, but also to just to identify and really know ourselves. I just find that in my own journey to be a really important concept, to be centered. And I've done centering therapy, I've done centering meditation practices and such, but my overarching self construct, making sure that that is healthy in all of these areas, is crucial in relationship building, I believe. So self-image and self-concept are two different things. Self-image is how an individual sees themselves, just like looking in a mirror in a practical way. It could be, but it is a more comprehensive evaluation, I would say, of our image. And what others actually perceive of ourselves too defines that image. So self-concept is more of a totality, and self-image is an evaluation of the image of self, how we see ourselves, how we align with, how does that align with reality, actually is a really important breakdown as well. Then you have self-concept and self-efficacy. Self-efficacy refers to the individual's judgment about their abilities. So self-efficacy, if you don't believe that you're doing well in something, or you're behind somehow, or you don't have a skill set, or you just are down on your abilities, that's a low self-efficacy. I think that, some people don't have that aligned to reality either. They think that they do better than they actually do. They're performing better than they're actually performing. But really, self-efficacy is really married to other people's performance. And we need to be very careful in not falling into that trap of, I would say, a efficacy dysfunction.
We could even talk
Not
about
to say,
imposter syndrome at this point.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
imposter syndrome is,
We
well,
talked about a
it's
little bit
not, yeah,
last
we
week.
talked about, it's not a syndrome necessarily. It's a psychological nuance or a tendency that we don't believe we're doing as well as we actually are doing. And that then draws a fine, that rides a fine line between narcissism and low self-esteem. So the idea that we're just looking to get attention, so we're going to be an imposter. I'm really not doing well. I'm really not doing well.
But really looking for
Or
affirmation the whole time.
yeah, exactly. Or it's a low self-esteem where you actually really don't think you're doing well, and there's a sense of depression. There's a sense of low self-esteem in that imposter syndrome. But then self-awareness. Self-awareness is your I would say the trait that involves basically how you are aware of your thoughts, your feelings, the totality of yourself, but then how ultimately that affects others. That's where that actually ends up. Is our self-awareness is what we believe about ourselves, the totality of our thoughts, feelings, and basically spirit and body and everything. But then how does that affect another person? How does that affect relationships? How does that affect close relationships? We need to grow in our self awareness. So, self concept actually has an entire huge theory behind it. And it's a deep psychological study. There's a lot of therapy that can be embraced and encouraged. If you find yourself low or misguided in any of these areas, I want to encourage you to find a professional, find a therapist, find somebody to help you work and do the work, because we're the only ones. I had a friend today tell me I am the only one that can do my own work. And I'm going to say that for everybody. We're the only people who can do our work. And so our relationship with God and others and ourselves, when it comes to our relationship with self, we need to do that work. And it might take going to a therapist, it might take going to a recovery group, it might take a lot of work, but we're the only ones who can. But I can tell you this, self-concept is not inherited, it's learned. And that's really where we need to land. We can learn new tools and a new way of being, a new way of looking at ourselves, and therefore looking at others quite differently. All right,
Learned,
self-concept.
I think in stepping back, learned doesn't is not all oftentimes not a choice.
Well, of course. So we do have
Yeah.
privileged systems and privileged
Well, even like
environments.
trauma based learning is
Right.
not our learning through
hmm
trauma. That's not a positive, but
I think
sometimes what
learning
we learn
from
and what we
trauma,
learning from, but what
yeah,
we've learned in are
no,
these like dysfunctions and how we view
no.
ourselves, and
How we got there is many times not our own choice.
not our own fault.
Right.
Let me take
Sharia,
Jesus for your
go
feedback.
ahead and take the image of God, the Imago Dei. You're going to spend some time in some
Yeah.
theology for us, so go ahead.
All right. So the Imago Dei is just Latin for the image of God. So we'll be using these terms interchangeably. They mean the same thing. Imago Dei, image of God. It comes from Genesis 1:26 through 28, which says, Then God said, Let us make humanity in our image, to resemble us, so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the earth, and all the crawling things upon the earth. God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image, God created them. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them and said to them, Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and master it. Take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and everything crawling on the ground. So some important cultural information to look at the Hebrew language. The words translated into English as image and likeness in the passage above are used in a few ways in the Hebrew Bible. Sometimes they describe offspring as being in the image of the Father. That shows up a lot in Genesis. Other times they refer to art, usually a statue that depicts a ruler or a god. Sometimes these images were worshipped or at least revered as a way of showing respect or adoration. And sometimes it gets translated into English as the word idol. So the word idol and the word image are sometimes the same Hebrew word, but not always. Something I found interesting was that in Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments, when God says, I am your God, don't have other gods before me, don't make images of anything and worship them. Images there is a different Hebrew word that also gets used to refer to idols. So, but then our first word for images, the same one that's found in Genesis 1, in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, like 1 Samuel and Ezekiel, it's there used to describe an idol.
So
basically,
so go ahead, Jake.
Do you get into, I don't see, do you get into Philippians at all?
I didn't do much with the Greek.
And so you look at Philippians 2 and the
image
nature
of
of God, equality,
yeah.
likeness, appearance, those are all plays with the Greek words for idol, icon,
right,
the same type of thing, image.
So this idea of image, if I could just ask, since you're the Hebrew Greek scholar of the three of us, the idea of image, or let's go back to Judaism just in general. The idea of image, or pre-Judaism, so Genesis, they were polytheists, so they, many gods, and you have the Ten Commandments that say don't put any other gods, or don't put God.
Have no other gods before
Thank
me.
you.
Yeah,
the first commandment, somewhere in there. So don't have any other gods before me. It doesn't say don't have any other gods. So the idea of a polytheistic world was very real, and images in a polytheistic world was very common.
Yeah.
So do you think that this is when the idea of the image of God, and I know that's a Latin Imago Dei, the original language, when this was said, we're created in a image, a self-image. Do you think that's just another way of saying God?
Kinda, or like maybe not God's self, but like the representative of, or the, like in the same way icons of the saints are not the saints themselves, but they're representations of, kind of.
I was just doing some noodling around with my own study, and I want to spend time with that in a later podcast, because I think there's something there that when we're called Christian, that means little Christ.
Right.
When we're called the image of God, that means a form of God. That goes deep.
Like, well, if you go to the other commandment of the 10, the no brazen images, no icons.
Right.
Same word usage.
So we have to I think pull that apart a little bit more. In the old world, what that could mean to them in that context of when it was first delivered. There's something very profound, but there's a very much practical. Let's move on to the practical. That's like up in the clouds theology crap. So let's move on.
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, that's basically a summary of what the Hebrew has to say. The word ranges anywhere from resemblance or likeness all the way to idol. So we're going to look at some theological arguments about what the Imago Dei is when it comes to humans. What does it mean for humans to be made in the image of God? I'm familiar with 3 positions on this topic, so that's what I'm going to share. It comes from a book called Across the Spectrum. So if you are a theology nerd, this is a great starting place. Arguments that show up in theological. And if you're not a theology nerd, ignore it. It's fine. There might be other ways of looking at the Imago Dei, but I am not familiar with them.
Okay.
I also want to note that these three views aren't mutually exclusive. You can hold all three of these views at once. And that's kind of a unique thing in theology. Often you can't hold multiple views on something and be consistent. Like, for example, you can't really believe that salvation is predestined and also believe that you have the free will to choose God. They're mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I don't
with
buy
these three.
either one of those. Yeah.
Right. But you especially can't do both of them at the same time. They're not compatible.
Right.
These three views of the image of God are pretty compatible. So the traditional view of the Imago Dei has been defined as the soul, or the immaterial part of the person. Usually this means something like the image of God is the truest part of you, or who you really are. This view emphasizes the eternal nature of the soul. So God is eternal, your soul is eternal, so the image of God must be the immortal soul. I think a weakness of this position is that Genesis 1:26 through 28 doesn't say anything about eternality. And in fact, in the other creation account at the beginning of Genesis, right, because there's two creation accounts in Genesis, the second one seems to highlight that it's an important detail that God formed Adam from the earth. So there's this emphasis placed on the physical body found in Genesis, and not so much on this idea of an immortal soul. I also think that this traditional view that the Imago Dei is the soul sounds a little bit more like Greek philosophy than the biblical text. So the Greek philosophy of Gnosticism emphasizes the separation of body and soul, saying that the body could do whatever it wants to do because the soul isn't tainted by it. And I just think the traditionalist view kind of flirts with Gnosticism there. So it's not my favorite. I think it's a little weak as a theological position, but I also don't think that there's necessarily any harm in holding this position. I just don't find it super compelling myself. There you go. Another view of the Imago Dei is called the functional view. And this links the image of God to the function that God gave humans in Genesis 1:28, where God says, "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and master it, take charge of the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything crawling on the ground." So in this view, the image of God is humanity's authority to exercise God's will. This looks like creation care, like supporting biodiversity, like making the earth a better place for all of its inhabitants. I think there's good support for the functional view in Scripture. One example is Psalm 8, verses 4 through 6, which says, "What are human beings that you think about them? What are human beings that you pay attention to them? You've made them only slightly less than divine, crowning them with glory and grandeur. You've let them rule over your handiwork, putting everything under their feet." The Bible Project has put together a really great video on the image of God that explains it in terms of the functional view. So I'd really recommend giving it a watch if you have time to do that. Just do a search for Bible Project Image of God. It's really beautiful. I find this view very compelling. It's a story that I want to be a part of and can find purpose in. And I think the functional view highlights that we all have a part to play in bringing about recreation, shalom, and healing the earth. And then I got one more. The third view of the Imago Dei is called the relational view. And this takes a really close look at Genesis 1:26 and notices that God says, "Let us make humans in our image." Some theologians consider this to be a reference to the Trinity. So in the relational view of the image of God, God's primary characteristic is relationship. God is relationship with the three persons of the Trinity. So this suggests that the Imago Dei in humans is our capacity for relationship with each other. This is supported by a modern psychosocial understanding of the self, that humans form their individual identities in relationship. We are who we are because of other people. So Jake's going to talk a little bit about the mirror concept of the self, but basically we figure out who we want to be because of other people and seeing how they are. If we see someone being selfish, we probably don't want to be that way.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. There are a couple weaknesses with the relational view. One is that Trinitarian theology dates back to the early hundreds CE, and it's not explicitly mentioned in the biblical text. So that doesn't make this necessarily wrong. It's just less grounded in Scripture. And I also want to be careful with this view if someone has an impaired ability to form relationships, whether by disability or mental illness. I'm not comfortable saying that some humans have more image of God than others, and that could be implied using this view.
The relational view.
Yes.
Yeah.
So despite those weaknesses, I still find some things compelling about the relational view of God. I think it places more of an emphasis on loving others than the functional view does. While I think implies loving, I think it's helpful to have it just outright stated there. But we do have to be careful of the potential dehumanization that can come from suggesting some people have more or less image of God than others.
So
there you go.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The second view. Yeah, the second view.
The functional view.
The functional view. Mm-hmm. I like that one as well. I found it interesting because I had your notes before the program, so that's a little unfair. And I did my own, deep dive, of course. I found it interesting, the other monotheistic faiths. So Islam, Judaism, Christianity. And Christianity actually... Say again?
Zoroastrianism.
Well, yeah, of course. Yes, but I'll say that those three.
The main ones, yeah.
Those main ideas. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Judaism, of course, is the image of God. It's written in Genesis. They would have taken that in their own likeness of God, that we're born in the likeness of God. Therefore, the love of self becomes very important in Judaism. I found that interesting, that Judaism has a definite focus on the care of self, the body, in a sense, as something that is to be cared for and nurtured. Islam, born into purity, born of the pure self, and able to make choices in here, like implanted in us, that we are able to make choices between right and wrong, moral choices. So in Islam, you're born, your body, your mind, your soul is born into purity. Judaism, it seems similar, that we're born into purity. It's really interesting and toxic that I think that Christianity is one of the only faiths. Now, there is another Vedic faith that talks about the body and the image of God. But it's really interesting that Christianity has definite toxic views of how we are born and what we're born into. And the downplay of the flesh, the hating of the flesh, which I know is a metaphor, right? But what people did with that wasn't metaphoric. And how we treated the body, or in modern Christianity, what I've dealt with in my groups, not necessarily the group that I'm with now, the church I'm with now, not really at all, but the lack of care or the focus on the body or the image, even if you called it the temple of God or the temple of the Holy Spirit, right? That focus on the image is thought of as sin. That if we focus on the self, that's sinful, selfish. We should never focus on ourselves. That's a pretty strong theology, doctrine, dogma in Christianity. But just the mere fact that we are born into this theology, which I don't agree with at all, born into, and we carry an original.
You're talking about
sin.
Original sin, yeah.
Yeah, original sin in our life. That's pretty damaging to the self-concept. That's pretty damaging to the self-esteem. But then the last one is the Vedics, the Buddhists, where their focus to control the body,
Mm-hmm.
So the mind is to be enlightened to control and can control the body. I felt that I find that one really quite interesting. That's what mindful practices our meditation, and the Vedics is to become at one with Brahma, or to grow in our enlightenment, to follow an eightfold path of Buddhism, that we are able to control certain things of the body. I just kind of throw those out there because all of the faiths have done something with the image of God, and what Christians have done might not have necessarily been the healthiest choice.
It comes from Augustine, and definitely has. I think most negative things feel like come from Augustine.
Yeah.
Couple of good things. Come on. Couple.
Yeah. So there's a book written a couple of years ago, Reza Aslan, that said "God: A Human History." Are you familiar with this, Raya?
Mm-hmm. I haven't read that one, but I know that it exists.
And so he takes the Imago Dei, the image of God, as being human, and he flips it on its head and say that the Imago Dei is the human understanding of what God is. So it's God created in the image and likeness of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
I think it makes sense. I want to be careful with my words because I don't want to suggest that humans created God. But
which his outcome is that humans created the being of God.
Right. But like, if we understand ourself in relationship to others, do we then understand God in relationship to ourself? So I don't think there's a way to avoid projecting a certain amount of humanity onto God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In, I think, sometimes healthy ways, most of the time unhealthy ways.
Yeah.
Especially in modern world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Jake, why don't you take self-concept, kind of pick that apart for us and lead us down the theory of self-concept.
The theory of self-concept. So we went through what God implanting God's image within humanity, and I would take the approach as well to build on what Shreyas said, and going back to Kevin's the idea of the 10 Commandments, to not create graven images, brazen something.
Graven.
Brazen.
Yes. Engraved images. There you go.
Engraved images.
Yes.
Because humanity was supposed to carry that image, right?
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The all of humanity was supposed to create the image in themselves and carry it forward. And so that retelling at the mountain is a new people group that was to go out and be the presence of God on earth, which is a beautiful story. But then we get into the idea of our self-concept. And like I went over earlier, self-concept, or the self-schema can also be called, is made up of lots of different things, lots of different ideas. The self-esteem, self-image, the ideal self, those all make up what a self-concept can be. And there's lots of other ideas floating around there, what makes up a self-concept. But for the sake of tonight, what are you saying?
I just said self-efficacy. Yeah.
Self-efficacy, self-assuredness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lots of things. For the argument tonight, I just want to focus on self-image, how we view ourselves, ideal self, how we want to be, and self-esteem, how we relate to others. So the how we view ourselves is what we feel like, what our head voice is, what we're saying to ourselves, what we believe that we can do, what we can't do. It can be a very positive experience or a very negative experience. I think in humanity, the positive experience is a very learned trait that we have to develop over time, and that it takes a long time to break that negative cycle. The idea of self is how we want to be, how we want others to perceive us, what we want to achieve. We did habits and goals last week. Did we do that last week?
Yep.
Goals 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, yeah.
Thank you. And so what do we want to accomplish? What do we want to be? How do we line up with that? Who is in our life that we look up to so that we can move forward? And then the self-esteem is how I relate to others, what I feel about myself when I'm in relationship to others. There's two ideas of self I want to pull out: the concept of the individual self and the idea of the corporate self. And I would argue that there is no view of self outside of relationship. That in order to have a view of yourself, you have to be around other people no matter what. That people are mirrors into your life, that you look at others and they tell you who you want to be, who you don't want to be, how you relate, how you even view yourself is based upon who you are. I'm sorry, based upon who you're around. The idea that relationship is that all of our self is bound up in community and not bound up with what we can produce by ourselves. So that's even the image of God, going back to there, that our image of God is based upon not just our individual self, but the entire community, the entire human race was created to be an image of God, the Imago Dei. And so then you look at even Aristotelian logic, and we got through this a while ago about Aristotle and how he thought the world was made up, that what we see, what we touch, taste, feel, sense around us, those things, those objects are just glimpses of what the actual object is of itself. And so our self-esteem, our self-worth, our self-image all make up the person, the group, the community outside of ourself. And so we are just glimpses into what that image is. Going back to the Imago Dei again, and I keep harkening on that because that is our self-concept, is how we relate to others, how we relate to God. That Aristotle will say that, even though I'm putting God in this context as well. So Aristotle's concept would be that we are mirrors of the person of God. That our self-concept, our self-esteem, our self-worth can be seen as mirrors to the person of God. And so then you get into the idea of, what do I want? And that's a much broader question than who I am. And that drives your self-concept. And so Rob's going to throw up a chart that we all hopefully have seen. And it's the Maslow's hierarchy of need. Physiological needs, so safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization, all of those make up your self-concept. That if you aren't meeting your physiological needs, your self-concept will be low. If you're not meeting your safety needs, your self-concept will be low. If you're not meeting your love and belonging, your self-concept is going to be very low. Your esteem and your self-actualization, what do you want to do? You can pull it down now, Rob. And so, what do I want out of life? What do I want life to look like? What do I want life to be? There's three philosophers that I pull from for this. You have Frankl, Kierkegaard, and Tillich. Frankl was a psychologist, philosopher. Kierkegaard was a philosopher out of the early 1800s, and Tillich, I believe, was at the turn of the century at Harvard Divinity School. And they all have this idea that suffering and despair is the honer of what makes us us, what makes us human, what makes us what brings up our self-image, ideal self, and self-esteem. That without trials, without things that we go through to make us better, our self-esteem will be low. Our ideal self, we won't actually know where to push to. And how we relate, how we view ourselves, we'll have nothing to bank on of how to build ourselves to be better. And so how do we develop a better self-construct, better self-concept, better self-schema? And I really just have the emotional intelligence development. So understanding your emotions, what makes us human, understanding how they affect ourselves, how they affect others, seeing ourselves as our image is directly tied to other people's feelings as well. So having emotional intelligence heightened, understanding your place in community, understanding your place of privilege or not privilege. Anyone that's watching us tonight on a device, you're very privileged. And so just knowing that you're in that position, so what are you going to do with that? And that also directly impacts your self-schema as well. Counseling is a big one. We just talked about that earlier, that to go to a professional, to dig out your history, your family of origin, culture of origin, what you've gone through to make you, and to reframe that to make it better is a really big positive experience in your life. And my last point that I have is, you are what you eat, but you are what your eats. And we'll get into food later, but consumption is not just about food. Your positive self-talk is what you eat. So give yourself the same grace that you give others. That what you consume, what your head voice is, that's a big change of who you are. Practicing gratitude is also that self-talk that can change your entire outlook on life. Balancing sources of information that come into you, that you're not just pulling from one side, that you're not pulling from the most loudest voice, that you are being balanced in your approach. But also, we learn who we are around dinner tables. And so eating with people is a very vulnerable experience. It opens yourself up. You have to sit down. You have to show your ugly eating styles, and you talk. So communal eating is one of the greatest builders of self-esteem, self-acknowledgement, self-schema that we have. And that's why it's important for our families to, and our kids to experience it, that we all eat together. And that's why, gosh, when you get together, you bring food, because food brings people together.
Awesome. Thank you. I think with self-concept and the idea of self-concept and what philosophers thought about it, and what psychologists have thought about it, there's a lot of, I would say, just self-actualization. How does that happen in order to achieve a healthy self-concept with all of the factors that you're saying? And so practicing some of the things that you suggested definitely bring about self-actualization. Like automatically, there's an automatic response loop that we engage in when we consume healthy things, when we do healthy things, when we engage in healthy behaviors. There's self-actualization that happens when we enter into that pattern or enter into that behavior. If that makes sense.
It does. And I think we enter into self-actualization any time when we are experiencing the lower levels of that pyramid. And we're actually...
Can you throw up that pyramid just really quick, Rob, again? Take another look.
As
physiological needs.
Physiological needs.
Right.
Because you're bringing food, you're doing whatever you need to do, you're giving to others.
Right.
Self-actualization really is the giving return around to give others esteem, love, and belonging, safety,
Yeah.
and physiological.
Maslow's, I didn't get to the top there. I was reading from the bottom up, and so I didn't get to the top. So he actually puts that at the top. Excellent.
Yeah, self-actualization. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think that one of the, self-actualization type faiths that are out there is Buddhism. And when you think about Buddhism and what they focus on when it comes to their nirvana or enlightenment, so nirvana is just not a band, it's an actual concept in Buddhism where we become at one with Brahma. So the concept of Buddha underneath the Bodhi tree had enlightenment at that point, a self-actualization of spirit, mind, body to become at one. So that now they have a recycling type mentality where we have a life cycle that returns to earth. So a reincarnate type attitude where we return either as a lower or higher being where we're given another try, right? But if we just take that concept, I'm not advocating for a religion or anything like that. But I advocate for Christianity, but I'm not advocating for another religion or something that you embrace. Yeah. But Buddhism has that enlightenment concept to become self-actualized, to grow in your awareness of how you treat self and others. And they have this concept of the mind stream where we are an animal. It's the Manushya. The Manushya is the animal with a mind stream. And what we believe about our animal self, our human being, really does affect the mind stream. And it affects other people's mind stream. So I just want to encourage us again that this is a really important concept when it comes to such things as the greatest command. We're to love other people. And as you love yourself or as you do yourself, and if you don't have a proportionate styled love where I understand love in this way, therefore, if you're in a deficit there, I don't understand love, we're not really going to give love. So if we're not loving self, we're not actually going to be able to give much out. And so, some people say that my bowl needs to be filled with what? Well, most of the self-talk and the self-deprecation that we do, like in front of the mirror or on a daily basis with our knowledge, our mind, our intellect, whatever, or how we're not performing, all takes hits against the nirvana, the enlightenment, the self-actualization. So what you believe about yourself really does matter. And what you believe about what you can do and what you believe about who you are and just your being a human being. Do you believe that you're good? Do you believe that you are, nice and generous and kind? Do you have those words to say about yourself? I think that there's some, go ahead.
We've talked a lot about, I think we've talked a lot about in the past the idea of viewing humanity as something that's good.
Yeah.
And that oftentimes that's the start of how do you view God and how do you view humanity? Is God angry? Is God gracious? Or is humanity good or is humanity bad? And so you almost set up this weird Venn diagram of what you believe, how you process, even how you function. If you believe God is an angry God and humans are bad,
right,
then how you treat yourself changes drastically.
Right.
Yep.
It really does. I think that our self-talk and what we believe about ourselves through our self-talk really does either build up or tear down. And there's another word that I want to give, because do you believe that humans or people inherently are good, giving people positive intent for that? But we definitely, do we still have sound? I see sound coming up.
for Shreya.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's me.
So, okay,
That was our
very
secret
good.
little thing.
That
but-
was our secret. Yeah. Sorry, I got caught off
Not
guard there. It's
anymore.
okay. Do you believe that humans are inherently good? There's another word that I want to use that takes it to the next level, and that is, do you believe that humans are beautiful? And there's actually two doctors and one exercise physiologist that I want to bring up right now. Two doctors by the name of David Sinclair and Peter Attia. Both doctors are white paper doctors, what I'll call them white paper doctors. They do science, and they really do find the human existence and longevity of humans beautiful. And their work is dedicated to healthy lifestyles and healthy living. There's an exercise physiologist by the name of Ben Greenfield. I have no idea really where these people's faiths are. I know Ben Greenfield is a Christian, but the other two, I have no idea. But just their concept of self and
before we
Yeah.
go too far, I don't think he's a physiologist.
Yeah, he's an exercise physiologist. So, or excuse me, not a doctor. He's an exercise physiologist, though, in practice, a practitioner. So the three of them have really inspired me in different ways, because here's people that just find the human body and our existence beautiful. And I just wonder, could we all get there? Could we all self-actualize to get there about each other and about ourselves? The idea of beauty goes right back to the creation story. And I've taught on this lots over the last, handful of years, that beauty is, well, first of all, just when we say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that's a judgment call. So that's a subjective judgment call against another person, usually said in a derogatory and negative way. Well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. When you're looking at somebody that's not very attractive to you, you just like say that to kind of just brush off the awkwardness or make a judgment of somebody else's looks. And really, beauty in our modern society does have a lot to do with looks. We have a hard time seeing beauty in much of anything besides a physical, attracted aesthetic. There's a lot more beautiful things that I think that if we would reflect on just a little bit beyond just a attraction or a aesthetic, I think we could see beauty in a lot more. But I would say that idea of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Who is the beholder? Well, I'm going to take you back into some Old Testament stuff in Genesis that I think is really important to find out who that beholder is of that beauty. I think that if we would find ourselves so beautiful and beyond just good, I'm a good guy, I think that that's nice to say. But if we would actually take it up a notch and find ourselves in a more than aesthetic, more than just a look, but we would actually have a deepened definition and affirmation of self, that we are beautiful. I do find that does transform our minds a little bit to more of a self-actualization, that if we could have that kind of talk in our lives. If you look at paintings and art and sculpture, and it's easy to see something outside that's beautiful, nature, trees, huge trees, or the forest, or go to a rainforest, you go, wow, this is incredible. This is beautiful. Usually that word really should be awe-inspiring, or it's in awe. You are in awe of something because it's so big and magnificent that you're taken back. The idea of beautiful in Genesis is reserved not necessarily for human-made objects, but it's reserved for God-made objects and people. So whether it be nature is beautiful, rivers, lakes, and streams are beautiful, the birds of the air, the animals are beautiful, and human beings are beautiful. So people in science spend their lives cultivating and preserving such things. Like an ecologist spends their life preserving the beauty of they're fighting to preserve the beauty of the earth. I think that music is a God-made thing, really, totally has to do with vibrations, and we're all just a walking vibration anyway. So I think that music is a God-given thing, and so musicians spend their lives cultivating beautiful things, beautiful vibrations, I guess. And so if we understand this idea of beautiful and how deep that goes in the mind of God, I think that could begin to change and transform our minds, our mind stream, to become more actualized than to love ourselves a little bit more and deeper, to be able to love others more and deeper. So when you look in the Bible, and those of you who are not familiar with the Bible, if you look in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis, in the Genesis record, I believe that story is a narrative poem. It's a Hebrew poem. I don't believe it's historical in and of itself. I believe that there's historical concepts, like historical concepts of like the earth is historical, right? And people are historical. So I'm not saying that the concept of the story is necessarily fake. What I'm saying is it's a poem that points to a different reality and a different story than a piece of history. So it's a narrative poem. It's a story that points us to a bigger reality than history or some characters that are going on. So you could actually take the word Adam, and that could be humankind. So it could be a larger group. The metaphors of the 7 days or 6 days of creation, the seventh day God rested, that is a rhythm of life. And so it's not by mistake, it's by intention that it's 7 complete days. It's by intention that Adamah is earth, Dam, red, blood from the earth, Adamah, Adam. I mean, it just makes sense that Adam is the person, yet the people. So if you start to look at the beautiful pictures and the illustrations and the art that is in Genesis, it starts to bounce off the page a little bit differently than this historical we're trying to be religious scientists, literally, with a book. So in that book, in Genesis, when God created all 6 days, at the end of that day, God said that it was good. When he created human beings, God said that they were very good. So Genesis 1:3, let there be light. God saw how good the light was. 1:10, God named the dry land earth and named the gathered waters seas. God saw that it was good. And like skip forward, Genesis 1:21, God created the great sea animals and all the tiny living things that swarm in the waters according to its kind, the winged birds, and according to its kind. God saw that it was good. So this word good in Hebrew is the word tov. And tov, now you could just phonetically say T-O-V, T as in Tom, O, V as in Valerie, T-O-V, tov. So when you just start looking and researching what the word tov actually means in Hebrew, you'll find a couple of things. And there's actually 3 options. And the 3 options are good boy, good girl, bad girl, right? Type of mentality, right? You're a good girl. You're a good boy, right? So there's a judgment call of the word good. They call it the moral good. So you have a moral good, and the problem with the moral good is you can't attach moral good unless you're a pantheist. You can't attach moral good to a tree. The tree was good. Good tree, bad tree, right? You can't really do that. It doesn't make sense in the language. But then there's also a well-being good. And unless you are, again, some metaphysical, like there's a spirit person in the rocks, which I'm not, but unless you are in the Hebrews, the Hebrew writer wouldn't have been. So so when you think about the well-being, good, I'm good, right? I'm happy, I'm good. When are you okay? I'm good. So you say good for a well-being good as well, and that can't be attached to objects and such. So the word tov is used for the swarmy things in the seas and also the birds of the air, and for trees and land and seas and people. So it has to mean something different, the idea of tov. So it's not going to be the moral tov. It's not going to be the well-being tov. It's actually the adverb tov, created good, where we have the earth created good, where that word then begins to take on an aesthetic judgment, where God looked upon the earth, the creation, and all that was in it, and called it an aesthetic judgment, said it was good. And so the only word that we have besides good, which has several meanings and almost like too many meanings to really single out what good actually means in life. God is good, and so is this spaghetti, right? So Rob Bell years ago said, I love Jesus, I love my wife, and I love tacos, right? You can say the same thing. Love has so many different connotations to it. You say the same thing about, and Rob Bell did an excellent job of that years ago. But now good is kind of that same way. My kids are good. I have a good well-being, and God created things good. It doesn't make any sense. So it has to be an aesthetic judgment, and that aesthetic judgment would be the idea of beautiful. It would be a judgment of, I created these things and it is supremely beautiful. So this is the proof of the Hebrew text that basically God is creating something in God's image, but also with worth, and God's aesthetic judgment giving it worth. So we have, from the moment that we are on the planet, right, created and living, breathing Manashaya, the animals with a mind stream, the moment that we are that being, God tells us that we have worth. And worth meaning you have a self-concept that's beautiful. You have a self-esteem that's beautiful. Excuse me, because self is a self-judgment. So let's change that. You have a concept. I'm giving you a concept that starts as beautiful. I'm giving you an esteem that starts as beautiful. I'm giving you an efficacy that starts as beautiful. I'm giving you an awareness that starts at beautiful. Through trauma and through crises and such, that's when that begins to chip away at that beautiful carving, that beautiful statue that God built and called beautiful. That's when we pull out the machine gun and start taking, bullets of sometimes our own negative self-talk, sometimes trauma, childhood trauma, adult trauma, any kind of trauma. It's like pulling out a machine gun and gunning your concept of beautiful. And so sometimes it's really hard to see ourselves as that. And I understand that. And there are practices that we can do to begin to become self-actualized that way again. I actually we use the word deconstruct a lot. And after this study, I have a hard time with that right now. I don't have a hard time with construct, right? Because we're the constructionists. But I have a hard time with that idea of deconstruct, because I've spent a lifetime deconstructing myself in a very negative way. And so Brian Zond said this, that faith deconstruction is actually art reformation. That sometimes we need to add a little more here and peel off a little here and the colors begin to shine through again, and we begin to see the picture again. And art restoration and reformation is one stroke at a time, and sometimes very meticulously working through a painting that has been damaged over a lifetime and bringing the color and bringing the Mona Lisa back to life, back to beautiful. And I really appreciate that, because the beauty is still there. The beauty is still in the image. It just needs that restoration. It needs that practice of reformation to become like God intended to call us in the beginning, and that was beautiful. So I'm called beautiful, which is kind of weird, because I'm not called beautiful, but every once in a while, some things that I create are beautiful, but being called beautiful is kind of weird to me. But I then read in 1 Timothy 4:4, where everything that has been created by God is good. So there that English word is again, but it's actually kalan. And that Greek word that Paul uses here means beautiful. So again, we have creation being tied to even a different language in a different time, far like well, if it depends on what you believe in about the Bible and when it was written, but literally far in advance in history, we see again Paul connecting creation to beautiful in a different language and a different time of his interpretation of Genesis 1. So that's that's some really digging around some language and God stuff and faith stuff, and noodling around those things that we are created according to two ancient texts of Old and New Testament, that were created in this image of God, the image, God's image, and that image is beautiful. And if only we can get there again. And I want to encourage us as just listeners and people to put practices in place in your life that reestablish, that restores and reforms what you think of yourself, what you believe about yourself, what you know about yourself, those things that you maybe need to regenerate or enlighten in your life. So maybe that is doing some auto self-actualization exercises. Like, for example, when we eat better, we feel better. When we do good, we feel good. When we clean up our mess, we don't feel like necessarily that area is a mess anymore. And so there's simple things that we can do in life that are very practical, that are very, very actualizing in our life. Can you guys just quickly think of a couple of more, because I'm lost, for a couple of more to give our audience tonight?
Practicing gratitude.
Excellent. So a gratitude journal of some kind. Yeah. Just sit down with a piece of paper and write some things down.
Write 4 things down.
Taking time to notice emotions, whether we're able to name them, whether we're able to sit with them and feel them, whether we're able to identify where they're coming from, if it's actually coming from the specific situation that I'm experiencing, or if it's a holdover from the past that's coming up.
Yeah. In my efficacy, I do list making. So I make lists now. I have for a while, but I make lists. And lists are really important to me, because if I do it on my phone, I can actually do strike-throughs. And my list then all of a sudden has all these strike throughs, and I actually see myself accomplishing, and it might be what we perceive as just simple things. But when we see that list strike through, we actually are seeing ourselves accomplish. That does something to our mind stream. That does something to our brain. It actually is an auto self-actualizing exercise. Any more? Just really quick before we end.
This one's not really quick, but therapy.
Well, yes. Yes. And again, we are not professionals. We don't consider ourselves therapists by any means,
Nope.
counselors, or any even close to the such. We promote professionals for that type of engagement and relationship. And so we want anyone and everyone. I think therapy is great. And I want to be a positive affirmer of therapy, whether it be traditional counseling or more advanced therapy that you and we might need. And some things are just difficult. And life throws us a real hard deck of cards sometimes. And we have gone through it. And I know each of us have gone through things that we've all needed help with at times. And so I want to encourage each and every one of us to seek therapy, seek counseling when we need it. And if somebody is looking at us and saying, I think this might help you, take those words and weigh them heavily. We want you to listen to the people around you as well that are promoting this in your life. So there's certain things that create neural pathways, trauma neural pathways in our brains that we need to do all kinds of just maybe visualization, reframing therapies, or even EMDR, things like that, that actually can help us overcome some of these so we can actually be, again, whole human. So remember that Jesus didn't come to just make us and give us a label and make us into something like Christian. He came to make us whole human. And I want to encourage us to practice and to seek out the help that we need to do so. All right. With that, good night, everybody. Thanks, you two, for joining us. And we're looking forward to next week. Next week will be, if I can get my notes out really quick. I don't have my notes in front
Fitness
of me.
and nutrition.
Jake, thank you. All right. Fitness and nutrition. We'll go over that next week. Looking forward to it. Take care. Good night.